All right. Hello and welcome to the 13th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I am Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and I am moderating the Reference and Readers Advisory track. Assisting me today is Angela Schneider with the Winnifox Library System, and we are glad to have you here. Our presenter for this session is Robin Bradford, Collection Development Librarian from Tacoma, Washington. She will be presenting Never Too Much, all about romance in and out of the library. Robin is going to take questions throughout the presentation, so as you think of them, go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A panel, and I will pass them along during the webinar. So Robin, whenever you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank Luther Vandross for the title inspiration. I try to name them all my presentations after songs or song lyrics. So thank you, Luther, for that. And because the other thing that is too much is how much I talk, we'd better get started. So when it comes to defining romance, people always like to play with the definition. It's a well-used word. It's been used, as you can see here, throughout art, literature, and music. I used to say that they're not accurate for romance, and I need to stop saying that because these are still accurate definitions of romance when it comes to these particular things. However, when we are talking about genre romance, these definitions have nothing in common with romance. They are separate things. Art defined it one way, literature came along and defined it a little bit differently. Music came along and said, us too, we have romance as well. But genre romance is completely different. It has nothing in common with the literature definition of romance, which is where you might think there would be some confusion that happens. So when we are talking about genre romance, what does it mean? It means that there is a central love story and that the emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending is present. Those two things must be there for it to be considered a genre romance. Romance readers are looking for a specific experience. And if those two things are not there, they're not getting the experience that they thought. So we hear a lot every few years. Well, now it's more like every few months. Someone will come along and say, I have a romance, but it doesn't end happily. It's not a genre romance. I have a romance and it doesn't need to end happily. All of these romances don't end happily. It's not a genre romance. And you're being too prescriptive in the definition, and you'll never grow the genre if you limit it to these few very narrow rules. There's only 2 rules. The rules are very broad. You must have a central love story in the work. You must. And it must have a happily ever after or a happy for now. At the end of the book, the love story is wrapped up and they're together. That's it. Anything else can go in that book. Those 2 things must be there. So when people say romances are all the same, that's both a feature and it's also untrue. The feature part is those 2 characteristics. They all end this way. They all have a central love story. They all have a happily ever after. Every single one. That's what people are looking for. That's the feature. But everything else that surrounds those 2 things can be literally anything. Any time, any place, any characters, anything. And that is where it's not true that they're all the same. They can be very, very different, but also share that core that people are looking for. So this is why some books are romantic, but they're not genre romances. And here again, we talk a little bit more about the definition. The main plot has to center around individuals falling in love. Is it only a man and a woman? Absolutely not. Do there only have to be two people? Absolutely not. But whoever is at the core of that story, those individuals are falling in love with each other. Not all love stories are romances. Bookstores may try to sell you on the fact that they're a romance because they don't quite understand that readers will get very, very angry if you give them something and you say it's a romance, you'll love it, and the characters die at the end. That is not what genre romance readers are looking for, and they will be very upset. This is a little bit of a cheat because it's drama, it's not narrative fiction, but it says tragedy right there in the title. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. But what happens if it's about romantic relationships, but it doesn't have that core happily ever after? General fiction exists. It exists for a reason. Not everything has to belong to a genre, and it's fine if it doesn't. There are some general fiction books that are fantastic. It's okay. It does not have to be a romance. Love stories are great. Tragic love stories are also great. It's just not a genre romance. All romances are love stories, but not all love stories are genre romances. And this is what happens to a book that does not meet genre expectations. And it's not just romance. We have genre expectations of mysteries, of science fiction, of fantasy. We have genre expectations of all genres. And if you give us something that does not meet those expectations, it's not playing fair with the reader. And it can take a book that's very good and turn it into something that people don't want to read. People may be upset with that author simply because they didn't meet the expectations. And so instead of saying, well, this isn't really what it was supposed to be, they may be turned off from that author forever. So it's good to match reader expectations with what the book actually is. Because if you put a picture of beans on a can of mushrooms, people will be mad. Does that mean beans or mushrooms are bad? No, you can like them both. You can absolutely like them both. But if I'm going to make something that needs beans and I open my can of beans and there's mushrooms, I'm not going to be happy. In fact, I'm going to be very unhappy. We're just trying to make sure that what someone expects when they come in looking for a thing is what they get when they leave. And that's, people read multiple genres. I know I do. I know others do. If I'm looking for a tragic romance, I will probably say, I won't say a romance. I'll say I'm looking for a tragic love story. Or I'm looking for something that really rips your heart out. It does not have to end happily. And I do add that part. So people know they can give me before you. it's fine. But if I come in, and if anyone comes in and says, I'm looking for a romance, I would never give them something where people die at the end. You can ask, sort of like a reader's advisory interview, but without that, err on the side of happily ever after. So let's talk a little bit about the categories in romance. There are several. They are shifting. I know the last time I did this, I had Christian romance up there, and I have removed that, and we talk a little bit more about fantasy romance now because that is the hot thing. But these are probably the basic mainstays of the romance genre, things that you have seen since romance was a thing, things that will probably endure in the future. And the most classic of those is historical romance. Right now, historical romance goes up through 1950. That has to be moved up. And this hurts my heart because the closer we move it to my birth year, the older I feel about it. But in reality, 1950 is historical, so is 1970. And honestly, in some aspects, depending on the age of the reader, so is 2000. A lot of things that happened pre 2001, you can't do those things anymore, and a lot of them feel antiquated. But we'll talk about that in contemporary. Currently up through 1950, mostly known for the Regency period and romances, and mostly known for British, specifically English romances. So specifically in London, actually. We have branched out. We've branched out to Scotland, so we have lots of Highlanders. Other parts of Europe, so you have Vikings and pirates. And also, we've jumped the pond and come on over to America. And we have historical fiction set in the West, historical romance set in the West, and also different time periods. So you have early 20th century, 1900, 1910s and 20s. You have Civil War era. You have Revolutionary War era. Lots of people writing about times that had not previously been seen, and from perspectives that had not previously been considered. So a real opening up of what is considered historical romance, which is great. All of the Regency romances are still there. There are still plenty of people writing about that time period. You have Isabel and the Rogue, which is fantastic because it takes 3 Mexican ladies and put them in the Regency period in London. You learn a lot about Mexican history as to why they are there in that time period. And you see them interacting with the world around them. We tend to think, and fiction has a lot to do with this, that people who weren't white didn't show up in these places. Like Regency London was all white. It absolutely was not. Regency France was all white. It absolutely was not. And that is the Adriana Herrera series with the tropical rebel gets the Duke. You see a lot of, and hers is more Caribbean, so her heroines are from the Dominican Republic in France. And so you're seeing a lot of new history being introduced in these series where they're taking the familiar, the Regency time period, the Regency era that we all know and love and have read about for ages, and we're introducing new people into them. People who were there, but their histories weren't written, and therefore their stories weren't written. So now it's like it's not a reimagining, it's more like an uncovering of people who did exist, who were there, and how they may have interacted in those societies. And it's fascinating. But on top of that, they're also just good stories. And here we have a couple of books on the ends who deal with America. So one during the I was going to say civil rights, but like 100 years before that, the Civil War is what I was reaching for there. One during the Civil War era, Alyssa Cole's series, which is fantastic. And a few years ago, there was a series called Decades, and they did a romance, each written by a different author, that did the decades of the 1900s. So this one is the 1920s, the Jazz Age by Cheryl Lister. And so you could find 1900, 1910, 1920s, and those were historically periods that hadn't been written about very much. Now you see more people writing about that time period. You even see TV shows now set during that time period. So we're getting a little bit more action in the early 19th or early 20th century. This Decades series was one of the first that I had seen that was specifically set during that time period. So contemporary romance. Again, if historical goes up to 1950, contemporary starts 1950 to present day. And just think about that for a minute. 1955, there's nothing contemporary about that. And if you're, 20, 25, there's not really much contemporary about corded phones and pre-internet time either. So there needs to be some sort of intermediate between historical and contemporary, modern historical, or something that captures that time period. But I would have a hard time trying to sell someone on an early 80s or even early 90s book as a contemporary. There are some similarities. There's cars, there's electricity, yes, but that's a really low bar for contemporary. I think of contemporary as something you can relate to as being in your immediate circumstances. A lot of that is not the case. But right now, we don't have an intermediate category. So contemporary it is, and it could reach from, early 70s, 60s, all the way up to written last month. It's the current catch-all category for current romances. And as such, it is a very, very wide category. And it contains all sorts of things. So you have modern cowboys, you have all across the globe. They can be have work, live in almost anywhere, do any kind of work. The setting is so wide open. It almost doesn't matter. Almost. It does matter in that it's also a great place to read about places you want to go or places where you live. If you want to find books set in a certain place now that you can relate to, like, oh, I've been here. Oh, they got this street completely wrong. They put this on the complete wrong side of town, or this reading this makes me feel like I'm back in that place where I grew up. This is a great category for that because they're almost like travel logs sometimes, especially books where they're like, pardon my Frenchy, you may not have been to France, but you're feeling a little bit like you know what's happening there. New York, Los Angeles, or small towns across the country set in places like North Carolina or even Washington State where you're thinking, yeah, I've never been there, but this is really giving me an idea of what it's like there. This is the category. With historicals, they're set in the past. So you're getting what it used to be like, maybe. But these are settings that you can kind of put yourself in. So that's fantastic. We love that. And there's situations, there have been even like a few COVID related where you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. You may not necessarily want to relive that so soon, too soon. But it's there for people who do want to insert a little happily ever after into a COVID story. That exists as well. And they're also incorporating all sorts of individuals. So while there are writers who write about LGBTQ stories set in the past, that started in contemporary. And it helps people feel connected in a way that maybe a historical wouldn't. So someone said to me once, I just want to read about a gay couple that doesn't have to pay for being gay. They don't have to pay. Usually they have to die at the end. Something tragic has to happen because we're not allowed to just be happy. And people heard that and took it to heart and started writing stories that had happily ever after endings for everybody. And to tie in a little bit with Misha's talk from earlier today, you don't have to identify with a certain group to read a book that features that group. If I only read books written by Black women, there's a lot more now than there used to be, but I still would be missing out on a lot of books. And if you are not reading books written by Black women because you're like, that's not me, that book's not for me, you are missing out on a lot of good books as well. We talk a little bit about this in our, Becky and I talk a little bit about this in our anti-racist service to leisure readers, but all books are for everyone all the time. And so you don't have to identify with any group to pick up a book that interests you and read it. And you might learn something, even though that book isn't there specifically to teach you, it's to entertain you. You might learn something anyway, just because it's not your culture or it's not your background. But that book can still be entertaining. It can still tell a great story, whether or not it focuses on any social conflict. It can still be a great story. You could still celebrate people falling in love, no matter their background and no matter your background. So keep that in mind when you're recommending books to people as well. Romantic suspense is kind of the action adventure or peril subgenre of romance. It can be contemporary or historical or futuristic, actually. Um, the suspense part of romantic suspense can range from barely there, oh, someone was chasing me, and it's in the first chapter, it sets up the story and never mentioned again. Or it can range all the way to, are you sure this is a romance and not a thriller? The very first romantic suspense book I read was about a motorcycle group of secret government agents. And there was a scene in there of a character being killed that was so graphic, I had to put it down for a minute and walk away because I did not expect that in a romance. Um, a lot of times they just gloss over the violence, kind of like a cozy mystery where the death happens off screen and then you have all of the things that make it a cozy on the page. This was on the page graphic violence. So it can range throughout. Sometimes reading a review, especially a Goodreads review, will tell you whether the violence was too much or not enough. And the main romance rules still apply. So while we're running for our lives, or we're spies, or a motorcycle gang fighting violence, fighting crime, you still have to have a central love story, and there has to be a happily ever after. And this is kind of how I think of that romance, the trajectory of romance throughout the years. You start off with these things that are very sweet, and we've progressed to having categories with assault rifles, and they are well used, and it's fantastic. If you like mysteries, or if someone likes mysteries and they're curious about romance, I would start them in a romantic suspense novel. And you could go historical spies, current spies, very much thriller-esque. So the race against time, we're trying to stop, a bombing, or we're trying to stop a kidnapping or rescue. Something like that may be to their liking. So when we say there's really something for everyone in romantic suspense or in romance across the board, there really is. A lot of people still think that the Operation Love book is what a romance is. Those are still out there. They have very contemporary, there's a whole Harlequin category of medical romances. They're still there. People still want to read it. But there is something for everyone. Long Haul Love was the first trucker romance that I had read. It was so wonderful. Very much on the lighter end of romantic suspense. So the suspense part is there to set up the romance, and it's kind of a thread throughout, in that one of the main characters is being chased for nefarious purposes. But it's not heavy-handed. Harbor, on the other hand, is a little heavy-handed and starts out with a murder, with all three of the main characters had a person in common that was murdered, and that's how they end up getting together. So they kind of have both ends of the spectrum there. And I just realized these are all contemporary. I do not have a historical example. I will have to change that. But there are historical spies, as well as the Spy Who Loved Him series, which is also very fun, but kind of walks the middle ground between violence and barely there violence. So paranormal and fantasy are two separate categories, but it's a question of, does the readership need them to be separated? And it's a question I don't have an answer to right now. Currently, they are separate categories. And how I describe them is paranormal is a recognizable world. So these are books set in Chicago, set in New Orleans, set in Los Angeles. But there's that thread of magic, of vampires, witches, werewolves, etc. But it's in a place that you recognize. So, and the difference between that and fantasy is fantasy, you don't recognize the place. It's a different world altogether. Paranormal romances also can be contemporary or historical. When you start talking about futuristic, though, we get into things that may be science fiction romance instead of paranormal. So there is a little bit of a line drawn there, usually just things we know. So it could be historical London or historical Ireland or Scotland for paranormal as well. And you see that these can also kind of run the gamut from more cozy, light to very much just on the edge of horror. When people talk about horror romance, they're mostly talking about gothic romances. But there's some that run right up to the line, where there's things that are a little bit more dangerous than you thought would be in a romance. And again, sometimes people have to read books to find out where their line is, because you don't know right off the bat. So it's great when someone brings a book back and says, whoa, that was a little bit too much, to dial back the peril or the danger and lean more towards the comedic or the fun. So fantasy romance, again, it's paranormal romance, but set in a world very different from our own, much like fantasy novels. And so there's a difference between urban fantasy, which is set in the world that we know, and fantasy, which is set in a completely foreign world to us. Same with paranormal romance and fantasy romance. It's still evolving. It's very popular right now, and you cannot swing anything without hitting a fantasy romance. But is it its own new distinct thing, or is it a subgenre of romance or fantasy? It's still evolving what it is. I will submit it could be either of the three, depending on the book. One of the things I get asked a lot about is why we categorized something as fantasy when it looks like a fantasy romance, or why we categorize something as romance when it looks like it's a fantasy novel. And the answer is we go a lot by the publisher. If it's a certain publisher that is known for publishing fantasy books, that book might end up in fantasy. If it's a publisher known for publishing romance books, that book might end up in romance. If it's self-published, we don't have that to go by. So we go by, does it feel like the center of the story is the relationship? Sometimes you don't know that when you're ordering, so you have to guess. A lot of guesswork. And does it have a happily ever after? Sometimes you don't know that either when you're ordering. And we set genre at the time of order. It can be changed, of course, if we discover we put something in the wrong place. But at the time of order, you may not know that. It may be a 50-50 balance, in which case both answers are correct. We don't put multiple genres on the spine, so we have to pick one. And whichever one we picked is right. It's just also the other one. So sometimes we have to let go of right and wrong and just make peace with the fact that this book is going to live in romance, or this book is going to live in fantasy. And it's not wrong. It's just not as complete as it could be if we put fantasy and romance and historical on the cover. But we don't do that. So, or on the spine, but we don't do that. So we have to make a choice, and then we have to explain that choice to staff and patrons who may be wondering why this, but not that. And here are some fantasy romances. One of the things that I love most about this category is that they have gorgeous covers. And that's my thing. I love a good looking cover. So I'm always very excited to see these, which is good because they are everywhere right now. And there's one of the Kimberly Lemming books that we were talking about earlier in the chat. I've heard these are great fun. I have not read them yet, but they are high up on my to be read list. And just for a second, let's talk about dark romance. So when I said romance was for everyone, that is true, but not all romances are for everyone. This is one category that is in red, in bold, not for everyone. Why is that? Because these are main characters that skate on the wrong side of society, or the law. They're often things like mafia or assassins, motorcycle clubs that are not secret government agents, but are in fact reveling in their illegal activities. And they can also have a lot of triggering episodes, including what we call dubcon or dubious consent. Those are things that people do want to read about sometimes, but they are also things that people absolutely, under no circumstances, want to read about. And so this is an area where reading anything that you can find about the book will help you when you're deciding whether or not you want to recommend that book, because they are not for everyone. Back in the day, before there was a category called dark romance, there was a book called Sunday, which was probably my first experience with dark romance. The main male character was waiting at home, thinking that he would be charged with rape for what he did to the female main character. And that's the kind of dubious consent that does exist or can exist. Not every book has it, but it is something that can exist and does often exist in this category. So now at least there is a category where these things land so people can be on their guard. And I will give authors a lot of credit. They put trigger warnings on their websites a lot for their books. So you can go there beforehand, see what they have listed, and know whether that's going to be a book for you or not. So a little bit about our tropes, because I am running out of time like I knew I would. Tropes are story points.
Can I ask you a question before you
Yes,
get into tropes and
please.
get out of the, and you have 20 minutes, so you're okay. The question was, you had the different categories on here. I have to go back to find the question. Was about the not including the Christian or inspirational romance, the attendee says this is a popular genre in their community, especially for their Amish population. But they're still being published and whatnot, right?
They
Yeah.
absolutely are. And actually, one of my favorite questions that Becky and I got during the Actively Anti-Racist was, we're telling people to diversify their collections. And someone said, well, what about Amish romance? And I think they were trying to get a little gotcha in there. And I'm like, well, no, absolutely. You should still have Amish romance if that is what people want, but be on the lookout for diversified religious romances, because they do exist. And we see that happening as we speak. So yeah, it's still very popular. It mainly just got taken off for time's sake. And one of my favorite things about inspirational romance right now, two favorite things. One is, one of the requests for reconsideration I got last year was for a religious romance, and I never thought that that would happen. And I will give the patron credit. They went looking for the category that they thought would be for them. And then they found some things in that book that made them want us to take it out of Christian fiction. But it was published by a Christian fiction publisher, and it had won, I think, the Christie Award. And so it was absolutely a Christian fiction. It just didn't match her specifications. But I never thought that I would get a request for reconsideration for a Christian fiction book. The second thing about Christian romance that I'm loving right now is that a lot of indie writers are writing it, and they're not necessarily adhering to the cover rules that used to be. So an author who wrote Christian fiction pointed out to me once that you never see people touching on a Christian fiction or a Christian romance. Like, they would be standing face to face, they would be standing sometimes kind of close, but there would never be like an embrace or anything like that you would see on other romances. And that has started to change. And so that is really interesting. You don't have necessarily those same cover clues that you used to have once upon a time.
Thank you. I'm going to save the other question till the end when we'll have time for questions. So I want to make sure you get through the rest of your content. So, but I wanted to make sure that one was timely in the categories. So
absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Robin.
So a little bit about tropes. The pendulum can swing from heavily using tropes as identifiers, but it hasn't always been that way. So the pendulum will swing back. But right now, people are very into, I want this kind of book. I want a book that absolutely has none of that. And so tropes are very important to help identify books right now. They're also stackable. So you can have a book with multiple tropes. And the good thing is, you don't have to memorize a bunch of tropes and a bunch of titles that match those tropes, because Google will help you out. One thing romance readers and librarians love to do is make a list and throw it up on the internet. And in tried and true librarian fashion, we will take that list and match it to the books in our collection and do displays and lists, and it's perfect. So just know that the tropes exist and that you can use them in several different ways. Marriage of convenience stories. This is an excellent example of a contemporary story that the trope is not the same in historical. In historical, marriage of convenience can be forced. People did not have a lot of rights back then, so it was more of a it's convenient for one party, not necessarily the other. In contemporary, it's more of a 50-50 give and take. You can't force people to marry you these days. So what do I get out of it? So it's one trope that can behave very differently depending on where you're seeing it. Friends to lovers, another trope, pretty self-explanatory, as is the next one, which is my personal favorite, and enemies to lovers. I love this trope so much. It can range from rivals. So we're both trying for the same job or something, and that's how we meet, and that's how the story starts, to true Hatfield and McCoy level of enemies. Um, this is just full of angst and animosity, which are two of my favorite things. Second chance, this is probably my next favorite trope. And this particular book is also enemies to lovers. So as you might imagine, I love it. It contains my two favorite things. Probably the most polarizing trope. Very few people have neutral feelings about this one. They either really, really hate it and it will ruin any book if they know that it's in there, or they really love it. Forced proximity can also mean multiple things. It can mean that we're locked together in a snowstorm. It could mean that you're forced to work with your almost brother-in-law who is the cause of you being left at the altar. Like this book, which is fantastic. So again, there's a range of what this can mean. And fake dating, fake boyfriend, fake girlfriend, another very popular, very fun trope, which also can pair with friends to lovers, because again, they're stackable. And there are so many more. Best friends, siblings, boss assistant, fated mates, May December. There's a ton of tropes. There are lots of things that people think are tropes, and sometimes we're like, yeah, that's not really a trope. That's more of a situation, and the line can be very thin between them, but there are many tropes. Trope plus Googling will get you a list of books to start off with, and then you can go from there. A couple of kind of roadblocks, reverse harem and reverse age gap. We seem to have mistaken the word reverse to mean things that it doesn't mean. For reverse harem, we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what a harem is. Back in the good old days of Twitter, there was a long conversation of what this actually meant and why, even if we take it to mean a man who gets to have sex with lots of different women, which is not the meaning of harem, the reverse of that would be monogamy. But that's not what the trope reverse harem is. It is a woman who gets to have sex with lots of men. It's a silly term. It's a terrible term, but it's also a term you need to know, because if people are looking for poly romances, you will not always find them under poly romances. You will find a lot of them under reverse harem. You will also find a lot under why choose, which is a much better term. We could also just call them poly romances, but we choose not to do that. Reverse age gap, which to me means they're the same age, but it actually means the woman is older than the man. So if it's a same-sex romance, reverse age gap does not apply. It shouldn't apply at all because it doesn't make sense. So you can try age gap romance. You can also search women is older romance, but also know that reverse age gap is a thing. And you may have to search it to get the most results for yourself or for a patron. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about covers. Right now, it's trendy to make everything look like a rom-com. You look at these two covers, and they look like they're two very different books. One of the hazards of this is that the first Losing It cover kind of gives you an idea of what kind of heat level is going on inside that book. The second cover gives you nothing. So if you're looking for little clues on the heat level of books, it is very, very difficult right now to find that. Again, this is a very cute cover, another one of my favorite books, but I don't get anything from that second cover except for it's about hockey, which I don't really get from the first cover, oddly enough. So I understand that you're wanting to sell more books and you do want to stay on trend. That's fantastic, but you're missing some things. So just be aware of that when you're looking for books. This one, I absolutely understand why she switched covers on this. Kind of sad about it, but I get it. One of these is going to be able to be displayed prominently in bookstores, in grocery stores, anywhere you might buy books. And the other one, you're probably not going to see on a Walmart rack. So I get the change, but it's also, again, taking away a little bit of your expectation of what might be at the heat level on the inside of the book. So just a quick note about how covers are changing. I think we're on the tail end of these illustrated covers, and I don't know what's next. But I know that all the books are starting to look the same, and that is about when things start to change. So that is it for me. Thank you so much. If you have questions, I would love to hear them. And if you want to reach out to me afterwards, there's my email, and you can always find me on Blue Sky, usually talking about books and covers and libraries.
Thank you, Robin. That was great. So I had a couple of questions or a comment about when you were talking about the tropes. And Beth says let's not forget my favorite, Grumpy Sunshine.
Yes. Yes.
I like that one. And then Carla asks, would you say a Hallmark movie is a trope?
A Hallmark movie can contain tropes. I wouldn't say that it's a trope in and of itself.
Okay. And then when you were talking about with the different categories and like especially the paranormal and the fantasy and the romance and all the different how they intersect and may contain more than one of the genres and trying to figure out where they belong. There was a question, if you know, do vendors like Baker and Taylor or others use those same genres that you are presenting? You said when you order you have the genres in mind. Do they have those?
They do, because they will have subject headings listed, but a lot of times the subject headings are fiction, fantasy, romance. And then right under it, it'll be fiction, romance, fantasy. And you're like, great, that's wonderful. So you do have to look a little bit into it if you want to get it as close to what you're doing in your library as possible. Not all libraries label. I know at my previous library, 2 libraries ago, they didn't label romance. And so that all went into general fiction. So I didn't have to worry about that. Some don't label fantasy. So, or they put fantasy and science fiction together. I mean, there's all different ways that people do it. So you have to kind of fit your library's way into what you're getting from the vendors. But they do put subject headings and you can decide, and sometimes they're not helpful, like I said, but you have to make that decision.
Do your do your catalogers or when they get to the processing part add some of the Like if you're going to put it in romance, but it's also fantasy or paranormal, do you have them add that in?
They'll add the whatever the subject headings are, and that's usually in the subject headings. So
Okay.
then people can click on fantasy slash romance and get whatever else is cataloged that way. So yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were talking about, where you would put it in all the different categories. So,
So when
um,
I am ordering, we sticker our books, not with the cute little stickers, but we just put they're just the name of the genre, and we put that on there because we do not break our collection into separate categories. It's
so you
all
have one,
filled, it's
okay,
all shelved together, but they have the labels on them.
okay,
And so when I order, I it's my job to put in what category what sticker it should get.
okay.
And so that's where sometimes it's like, is this romance? Is this fantasy? Which is it? Sometimes
Mhm.
it legitimately is both.
Yeah,
But I can only pick one.
you have to only pick one. Okay. You don't want sticker labels all the way at the top of the screen.
Exactly.
Um, the Sarah Moss books, am I saying that right?
Yep.
Maas. Wendy asks, what is the trope for the Sarah Moss books? Do you know that?
Oh gosh. Um, I mean, it starts off a little bit of enemies to lovers. There's definitely some forced proximity there. Um, I think this is one with multiple
Multiple?
tropes.
Okay. Thank you, because
I
I'm
think she leans heavily into enemies to lovers though, because I'm thinking of what is it, the fourth book? There's a lot of enemies to lovers there as well. So
okay. Thank you. And then Angela asked, do you have any recommended go-to resources to help us learn more about the spice level and content of books to help us with RA and meeting patron content requests, especially those with some of like those illustrated covers you were showing?
so in my book, the Reader's Advisory Guide, or the ALA, I don't even know the name of my own book. That's terrible. The ALA Reader's Advisory Guide to Romance. I talk a little bit about that because the resources are difficult to find. Um, Usual now that Romantic Times is gone, and they used to helpfully label every single book. Now that that is gone, you can find a little bit on personal web pages where people have kind of tried to recreate that um, heat level guide. The problem with that is everybody's heat level can be different. So, what I might call an erotic romance will definitely be an erotic romance. But I might label something else as, typical, and somebody else is thinking, oh my God, that's the hottest book I've ever read. So a lot of times when you're relying on personal um, direction, it's not going to be as accurate. And I have not seen since Romantic Times a consensus of hot, mild, anything like that. I might try the website Smart Bitches Trashy Books because I know they've been around. This is their 20th anniversary. I know they've been around for a while. I'm not sure if they have something on there, but that would be the first place I looked.
Okay, thank you. And Jane adds, the All About Romance website includes heat level in their reviews, and you can search their reviews database for it. She said it goes from kisses to burning. So that's
Yep.
another.
See, there's another great resource.
Mhm.
And they're
Thanks, Jane.
actually a great resource just across the board for romance.
Yes. I put a link to your book in, it's called The Reader's
Thank
Advisory Guide to
you.
Romance.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And we have it in our professional collection at South Central. So if anybody here wants to borrow it, you certainly can. And that brings us right to 2 o'clock. So perfect timing, Robin.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Robin, for a great session. There will be a short survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. And just be warned, we've had a few glitches with that. It might say the wrong title, but it's connected to the right webinar. So go ahead and fill it out for today's webinar. Just wanted to let you know that. We really appreciate your feedback. Our next session in this track is with Carol Hassler, and we'll begin at 2:30. We hope to see you there, and if not, have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Robin.
Bye,
And thanks,
everybody.
Angela. Thanks, Robin.